You have an idea. You want to tell it to the world, but you don't know where to start. That's where Anchor comes in. They have the tools for you to edit, produce, and record your idea right from your phone or computer. It's the easiest way to reach and grow your audience. They publish for you to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major platforms. And to top it all off, they match you with advertisers so you can earn from your passion and your wonderful idea. So tell me, what are you waiting for? Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started and follow your dream. It's time for another episode of Disruptive Adventism, everyone. Thank you for listening. I just wanted to say that you're going to hear a lot of background noise today. We are outside of a public location recording with Tony Sandoval, who's going to be helping us out navigate through a very interesting conversation of how is it being a second-generation Hispanic in the United States. And we're going to be talking about that, so just pardon a lot of the background noise. You may hear machines, people, carts. It's just going to be a mess, but we're going to try to do our best and edit it out as much as we can. But before we get into the topic, we have Tony here, so he's going to tell us a little bit more about himself and where he's from, and just details. Go ahead, Tony.
Thank you, Jose. I'm currently living in Chattanooga, Tennessee. For 1 year, and before that I lived 5 years in the Atlanta, Georgia area, and I also lived 3 years in Michigan before that, and 30 years in New York. That's where I was born and raised, and it was a culture shock going from living in New York and then seeing different parts of the country, Michigan, and now the South, Georgia, Tennessee, as a second generation Hispanic.
Why is that?
Well, I guess comparing a big city to these smaller cities is one aspect. But then we have just, I guess, my physical appearance here in the South. The general reaction is because the majority of the Hispanics here in the South are recently arrived first generation, not fluent in English. I get that stereotype where it's assumed I don't speak fluent English, and so I do get a different treatment, I feel, and it's not until I vocalize or verbalize and express myself that it is I understood that I am fluent in English, that I get a different treatment.
So you get a lot of prejudice, that's what you're saying.
Yes.
Now, you're from New York. That's where you've spent most of your life.
That's right.
And from, a New Yorker, right? How is that, comparing living as a second-generation Hispanic in New York? I see a lot of diversity, right? Is that a fair assessment? You see a lot of people that are not like you, or, they're just from different walks of life. Do you think that there's not prejudice in that area as well, though? I mean, is it just in the South that you felt it, or is it all throughout?
There's definitely prejudice in New York City, and it is very diverse, but it's at the same time segregated in the sense that Brooklyn, you have your Russian neighborhoods, your Jewish neighborhoods, your Black Caribbean, your just Hispanic neighborhoods. And they're clearly marked from one street to the next, where the majority of a particular ethnicity are the majority. But there is that general respect where we still ridicule each other in school growing up. That's the Asian, that's the this, that's the that, that's the Hispanic. And so you still have that, of course. But here in the South, to answer your question, I feel like it's more us against them versus New York. We were all in it together.
Okay. So the fight was more unified in the north, northern area than in the South. You see maybe a clearer division. Maybe
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Does that translate to your religious experience?
I'm still processing that question. Does it translate? Yes, to an extent it does. It does, because I am engaging more with the churches I pastor are predominantly Hispanic. So yes, and at the same time, I feel I have something to contribute because it's just like when you come to a potluck lunch dinner where everybody brings a different entree or plate to and everybody contributes. That's how I feel the church experience has been in general. Just everybody's coming from a different perspective, a different background, and we all learn from each other. We all support each other. So definitely, yes. I do see that I could learn a lot from different cultures, different ethnicities, but specifically in my line of work where I pastor two predominantly Hispanic churches, I could relate to a lot, whether they've lived in the big city or a small city in the United States. I could relate to them.
Okay, but is it that, as a second generation Hispanic that grew up in New York with diversity and, all of these beautiful, like maybe contributions, you see it from that perspective, but now in the South, do you feel a different sense of religiosity emanating from people in the South? I mean, that's the general perspective that an American would have, right?
Yes.
Is that accurate, of your experience? Because you were not a pastor all the time. Like, you were not a pastor forever. You haven't been a pastor forever. But you've traveled, maybe you've seen different things. And as a person, like just as a churchgoer, being second generation, is it different than, what are those differences? Like, with second generation and just other regular, religious people in the area, South, North, go ahead.
Okay. I thank you for that clarification. I understand better where you're coming from. How I understand it, how I perceive it is that here in the South, the Christianity is sincere in general, and it's ingrained in the American culture from U.S. citizens that have been here 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., going back many generations. It's just that just rich-blooded American. The Bible and Christianity is ingrained into that. But I see the ethnic flocking together, depending on your ethnicity, is like almost trumps or does take priority over your Christianity. And I could be wrong, but that's how I perceive it. So what I'm trying to say is that even though we're all Christians, for example, somebody that's originally from the U.S. versus a first or second generation Hispanic, we're all Christians probably, but we're not going to worship 9 times out of 10, unfortunately, together, just because the families and the cultures where we originate from, and there's a language barrier too, do cause those separations. And so, yeah, it's a challenge.
Okay. Now, coming from, as a second generation Hispanic, I came to the United States. So I speak Spanish fluently and I speak English fluently. You do too. But it's a different landscape, a different mindset, right? That you are engaging, that I'm engaging, right? Because you never experienced, or maybe you did, I don't know, but you never experienced the quote unquote motherland, right? You are in the United States, you've been living in the United States, but you've been treated differently depending on the location. Now, when it comes to just like thinking about worship, right, or religiosity within the United States, right? Like I came to the United States, so, and usually people that come to the United States of first generation, they end up just sticking to their own culture, sticking to their own, language and worshiping in that language. You have had that dual modality, whereas like I grew up in a Spanish home and probably you went to Spanish church, but you had the option. So how did you navigate through that?
It was a bit of a culture shock because even though you're right, that I never lived in a Spanish-speaking country. My parents are originally from a Spanish-speaking country. So it was an interesting experience because my mother, to this day, she's in her 70s. She's retired. She never had the urgency to learn English because we lived in this ethnic enclave neighborhood in New York where the store down the street, the whole neighborhood, her job.
It was just like the motherland
church,
right there.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a Spanish neighborhood, Spanish speaking neighborhood basically. And that's the environment I grew up in. But as I got older, and then I felt the call to serve, to become a minister, to become a clergy, a pastor, when I automatically the way I was wired, I was thinking, well, I'm going to pastor a Spanish-speaking church. But the reality was another when I was told, no, you are documented, you're a citizen, and you're bilingual, you could easily work in the English-speaking churches. So it was a bit of a culture shock because I was taken out of my comfort zone, which isn't in hindsight necessarily bad. But what they had been doing for many years is bringing pastors from Latin America and ministering to those first generation Hispanic. So it was, like you're saying, the motherland where basically the Spanish speaking country mentality was brought here into the US. And that's the environment I grew up in. So I was living in a certain bubble within the United States, you could say, in that regard. And, but at its core, it's beautiful, where a lot of what I learned in Christianity, in the environment I was exposed to growing up, could be bridged to different ethnicities. So, I ended up working 3 years in New York as a part-time associate pastor. And it was different ethnicities now, where I was dealing with some second generation Hispanics, but there was also Russians and Caribbeans, and so it was an interesting experience.
You grew up here, so you probably were a child that went to a Spanish church, right?
Yes.
When you reach a certain age and you realize that you speak both languages, right? How do you decide to stick with one of them, and like primarily use that one? Was that something that crossed your mind, or like, because I see something that happens usually in first generation Spanish churches, right? They start having their kids, and in the first couple of years, it's not a problem, but you can see it like once they start hitting puberty, right? 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, they start hitting that age. And something that occurs is that what happens is that their classes are still in Spanish, but they think in English. How can we mind that gap? You're a pastor now. You went through that age. How do you feel? And what are some of the things that you think can be helpful for people to understand for kids that are second generation and they may speak Spanish, but their language, their heart language is not Spanish?
Yes, definitely. I could relate to that. I think in English, and it's easier for me to communicate in English. Spanish, there is that like couple seconds of delay where I have to process it and then translate it in my mind into Spanish. So I have become used to it, but to your question, I had to come to the realization that I'm a hybrid in that regard, because I do have this passion for the Spanish culture I grew up in, but I don't communicate as fluent. And also the culture, just like a lot of the TV shows that were seen by these first generation Hispanics, that they were like, you never saw that show, you never saw those episodes, and I'm like, no. And so I do feel a disconnect culturally, even within the first generation Hispanics. And I could relate to the second generation Hispanics growing up in this country, where it sort of became a big joke now online. I see a lot of these things, like comedians making fun of us second generation Hispanics growing up in this country, and a lot of the things that our parents do or say that just clash with the American culture. And so it has been a juggling, but I've enjoyed it because it's the culture that I could most identify with, is not Hispanic but second generation Hispanic.
Now, how can we help people navigate through that conversation for kids that are going through that struggle right now in our churches? Do we recommend them to reach them in their language or their parents' language? What's your take on that as a pastor now? Like, should we, get rid of Spanish? Is that the goal? Like, Spanish work to get, like, you get rid of that church generationally, or is integration, assimilation into the culture? Like, what's the goal? Like, I mean, there are a lot of people that are very strong about this. Like, my son's going to speak Spanish. They need to know Spanish. They're going to go to a Spanish church and they're going to get their lesson at church in Spanish, even though, like, they may not understand Spanish, because they're second generation. So how do we mind that gap, with parents, with pastors, administrators? You got the wisdom. Go ahead.
I don't know if I have the wisdom, but I have the experience. And what I have noticed is that we could better understand when it's explained to us in English. You break it down, the nuts and the bolts, about, in this case, the Bible, Christianity, religion. Explain it to me in English, but when we're going to go to lunch, we're going to enjoy the Spanish food, and you're going to tell me, we're going to hear stories of the grandparents when they were living in the original Spanish country back home. And that history, that struggle that they brought, that we should be thankful because of their contribution. We wouldn't be here where we are, and they struggled. They came to the U.S. So I honor them. I'm very respectful of that. At the same time, nothing against them. I just understand the Bible and the lessons, as you're saying, better in English. Now, my son, for example, he's 7 years old. He's in first grade. He is basically a third generation Hispanic. And my wife and I are intentional on speaking to him in Spanish at home and raising him bilingual. And so by default, he is going to be learning English. He's picking up English so much faster. But I do see how it's also helping him appreciate his background, his culture, when we're teaching him the language of his parents and grandparents.
You pastor two churches, right? Yeah. One is fully Hispanic and one is a hybrid.
That's right.
The hybrid one may have, any given day, whatever, half and half. You have second generation Hispanics, first generation Hispanics. You have African Americans, Caucasians, like, different people coming through, right? Do you feel like second generation, not necessarily just Hispanics, but like people from other countries, just like second generation Americans, right? Because that's just their reality. You're an American, you're just Hispanic background, But second generation Americans, do you think that they're better positioned to reach people than, like, let's say third or first or fourth, because of their experience, their hybrid experience, as you put it?
Only in the sense that they could relate to what other second generation Americans are going through. Like second generation Koreans could relate to a lot to second generation Hispanics in that whole, like, appreciating the native culture, but at the same time being able to understand, be more fluent in the current language, English language. But as far as like being able to communicate better and understand better, I think that comes down to more needs of that individual. When somebody realizes that they're deficient, more needy, they're going to be more receptive to a message of hope, a message of the gospel of salvation in Jesus, versus somebody that's really comfortable, regardless whether they're first or second, third generation. So I feel it's more of a economic attribute that hinders people from wanting to appreciate or be sensitive to the good news of the gospel versus culture. So I do feel there's a hierarchy there.
This hierarchy that you're speaking of, that's not only in religion, because like that goes into education, that goes into like access, right? Have you felt as a second generation Hispanic that your, understanding of America, politics, religion, everything is filtered through what other first generation Hispanics are going through or first generation immigrants are going through? Like, votes that you make or like people that you support religiously or, politically or whatever it is. Do you find yourself like looking at your needs first as a American, second generation American, second generation immigrant, or do you filter more like I want to benefit my parents, I want to benefit that generation that's just coming? How have you felt that? Because it's a struggle, where like you're from, like your parents are from another country, they may not have that English privilege, for example, but they may, like you may be able to change that, through your votes, through your things. So talk to me about that.
I think we're getting more into politics, where, and to be honest, I don't feel personally that how I choose politically or with my vote is not, my priority is not the first generation. I do feel I am more, have assimilated more into the American culture because just things have changed so much every decade as far as immigration policy, where I don't, to my understanding, feel I could really make a difference to the first generation Hispanics that have arrived here recently, politically or with my vote, if you will. So I do feel more with the mainstream U.S. culture in that regard, where, for example, illegal immigration. I don't justify illegal immigrants that are Hispanic, because I do feel that they should try to come here legally. I understand there's extreme circumstances and exceptions. So I'm not saying that cold-heartedly, but I'm not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater as far as support first generation blindly.
Okay, so if I hear you correctly, you're more like cautious of just saying like, hey, my parents are immigrants, I'm just going to support whoever comes here. You're more like, let me look at it from an objective standpoint, or as objective as I can. Is that what I hear from you?
Yes.
Okay. That's really interesting because like, I came to this country and like, I look at it differently because I came to this country. I don't know, like, it's just interesting, because I hear you, like there's a problem, with immigration, and like it needs to be fixed. Whatever your political affiliation may be, it needs to be fixed. Like, like people need to get to it. But that may be for another podcast. Maybe we'll do a podcast on immigration. Definitely. It's necessary. It's more than needed, actually. So we'll promise you one for the audience. You're listening. We're going to do one on immigration. But going out of that kind of like idea, I wanted to ask you, do you relate to the struggles of first generation Hispanics? Like economic or, lack of access, stuff like that. And as a pastor, how do you, support them in that struggle that they have? Because some of them may not have documentation and they may not be able to, work in the same way that a second generation immigrant, like, or an American that's second generation will be able to do. Their children, will have a better opportunity. But how do you mind the gap between that, lack of access, education, economic ideas, and your role as a pastor? How do you support them?
I understand that I'm limited as a pastor, how I could serve my congregations, my laity, as far as it's a spiritual nurturing that I could do. Obviously, if there's needs, if they're hungry, if they need shelter, I'm going to try to, as best as I can, supply those needs. But there's also government resources in this country that I could rely on, shelters and food banks to supply those basic needs. And there's also at that same with that same intention, there's also lawyers and law firms and legal experts that could help people in their situation, be it as it may be, whether they're here undocumented or not.
So you're saying that, in your view, I mean, and maybe this is something that you gathered from the church that you grew up in, and stuff like that, that your role is more predetermined towards spiritual needs. But the reality is that the role of pastors in America has been a little bit different than that. I mean, if you think of a lot of, pastors are like the original influencers, right now we have a digital influencers, but pastors have been influencers all throughout time. I mean, you think Martin Luther, sure, that had to deal with some theology stuff, but it had to deal with a lot of justice. And I'm not talking about Martin Luther King, which also had to deal with that, but Martin Luther, I'm going all the way back to the Reformation. This was a political engagement of pastors with religion and justice and everything. And, all throughout, there's this tradition of pastors just being, there for their people groups, right? And to help them. But you're saying that more of your role is more spiritual and maybe deferring towards the government, towards that. Do you think that you were influenced as that, just because of the way that, I don't know, you grew up in a first generation church? Because I see a lot of second generation immigrants actually doing the opposite. So what do you attribute that to? Maybe you don't. Maybe that's just how you think now, or I don't know. Go ahead.
So I'll just clarify. Every case is different. So case by case, every situation will be different. For example, in my last district, when I was pastoring 3 first generations, predominantly Hispanic churches in Georgia. And Georgia is one of the 5 states that is harshest towards immigration, or illegal immigrants specifically. And so under the Obama administration, any recently arrived illegal immigrants that were caught were sent back. And I was in one of those experiences where this particular church member, he came when he was a minor, and he's 16, and then he lasted about 2 years here in this country. But when he turned 18, he asked me to accompany him to an appointment he had with the immigration department service. And so I went with him, and they arrested him right there, and they deported him. And there was nothing I could do as a pastor. I was limited to the law. I was limited to my role as a church pastor, and I have to realize that.
When you say that, I'm pretty sure that was really traumatic. I mean, I don't know how I would have reacted, but didn't you feel like you wanted to protest a little bit? Just the way that that happened?
So in that particular moment, we were both really tense. His dad is also undocumented, so his dad couldn't accompany him, and so he asked me. I went, and he knew that it was going to be instant separation from his dad that has been here for a few years, and he has been really roughing it, sending money back home. And so at that moment, I was trying to calm him down, the 18-year-old, and I was telling him, just cooperate him, don't try to rebel, because it's only going to make things worse. So that, in that particular moment, was my role as the pastor, and I was giving him hope. I was giving him spiritual guidance. I was encouraging him that God was going to be with him and protect him, etc. But yes, as far as your question, I do want to protest, and I needed to educate myself, and I took a course on immigration, a 40-hour course, and during that time, and I would go with this young man and his dad. We would go to the lawyer, and we would find out everything that needed to be done, the appointments with the immigration. So I felt, I did my role as a pastor, supporting that family and doing everything I could within the laws of the land. But I'm limited, and there's only so much I could do. I wasn't going to start fighting with the arresting immigration officer that was going to deport him.
Okay, yes. I mean, like, and I think that goes into like another part of the experience of second immigration, like, I'm sorry, second generation Hispanic. There you go. Finally got it out of my system. But, like, when you see that, you were born here and you had that privilege, right? Of, if you wanted to, right? You could become the next president of the United States. Like, like you have that ability. Like you can run, like, any eligible 30-year-old that was born in the United States, you can, and within there's other requirements, but like, and I'm kind of wondering, like, your parents came here documented?
Yes.
Okay. So you have been helping and talking with families that are undocumented, right?
Among others.
Of course. Yes. Among others. But do you feel like there's transference? Like, the idea that their problems become yours just because of the sheer fact that you share a certain Hispanicness among you? Like, do you feel that as a person or as a pastor? Like, especially as a pastor, because like you don't only deal with like pastors usually deal with spiritual stuff, but more often than not, they deal with real life, So like, do you feel like there is that transference where they see you as some sort of like, like, man, I wish we could switch roles. Do you have that? Like, they transfer their problems into you, especially when it comes to immigration, knowing that you also suffer. I mean, you pointed towards that you suffer a certain kind of discrimination, right? It's not that you're different. I mean, you may look like a Hispanic individual, but you're from America, right? You were born in the United States. So, but do you feel like your congregants transferred that weight into you? The undocumented ethic into your life?
Yeah, definitely. To an extent, I was there empathizing with them, and I still do. And it has helped me be more sensitive about the situation, where I know firsthand what they have escaped from and what they've risked to be here and what they've suffered. And so yeah, I've been exposed to a lot of that, and I understand it. So definitely, but also the other thing, Jose, that I've realized is that I've become a bridge to where those delicate sufferings that they've shared with me, I've been able to communicate that with other second generation, other not Native Americans, but
Americans that have been born in the United States. Yes, not Native Americans. I understand what you're saying. You translate it right there. Because in Spanish, that's how you will say it. Like, like people that are native to like native doesn't mean, as in Native Americans, people that were here, people groups that have been here for a long time. But native is just the idea of someone that was born in here. Maybe we can say, I don't know, national Americans, I guess, like, just nationals, I guess. I don't know how to explain it. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, non-immigrants.
Yes. And that's like, that's very interesting that we're having this moment right now, because like, I know what you mean, and I know that you did not want to mean something different.
We could coin a term.
Yeah. But like, at the same time, it's just like, I see that because I understand what you're trying to say as an immigrant. And even though like I'm an immigrant, like, my English is different. I have an accent. I mean, but it's like a lot of people always tell me like, and this is a microaggression to a certain degree, you know, but they always tell me, like, you know, people tell me, like, yeah, your accent is not that bad. And I'm like, you know, I wish that you wouldn't say that. Like, you know, like, I really wish that you wouldn't say that, you know, but that's part of the education. And you know, you were talking about bridging, and I think this is the last thing that we're going to talk about. But you have had the experience of translating for your parents, right?
Yes, interpreting.
Yeah, like interpreting, like, you know, when you go and you're used as a middleman between any authority or anything and, you know, your parents.
Yes.
What are some of the other work that you have done in that sense? Like, you know, do you feel like you have this moral responsibility to be like the translator of people? Like, you know, like making people understand what they're saying to like other people, and especially as a pastor. I mean, like, how do you translate, you know, religiosity or, you know, like activity in the world, economics? Like, I mean, there's so many things, right, that people go through. How do you do that? I mean, you were touching on that, like, you know, bridging and educating other people, but what are other examples that you can?
So bridging multi directions from those first generation illegal, undocumented to the non-immigrants, Americans, and vice versa. And so I've been in several interesting situations where on both sides of the conversation or the extreme have been shocked. Oh, we didn't realize such group of the population felt that way about us, or vice versa. And sometimes it was good, sometimes it was bad reaction, depending. So it's just been a learning experience. And I have interpreted it and translated documents and also verbally. And it's not word for word. It's also concepts, idiosyncrasies that exist in either language or in either culture that are not translatable, or it's not possible to word for word interpret it. But it's the meaning. It's the meaning. So that is what, in general, my life, I guess we could summarize, is that I got the meaning of both these populations here in the United States, whether they've been here for many generations, whether they just arrived, and I feel I could relate to both in the language and in the culture, and it's very enriching.
As that translation has, you know, taken place, and you're saying that can be summarized, give me one more idea of maybe like something that people can learn from, you know, second generation Americans, Hispanic, you know, Hispanic backgrounds. Tell me, like, what is it that, you know, when you approach somebody, what will you hope that people learn from you automatically just from being a second generation American from a Hispanic background?
I would hope that they don't automatically assume that I either don't know English or haven't lived here too long or don't understand this country, or on the other side of the spectrum, am totally oblivious to Spanish culture and don't speak Spanish very well. And so both extremes is what makes me cringe sometimes, that I get pushed to either side. And what I would appreciate is if people in general would just get to know me for what I've been through and what I could contribute to their understanding based what I have experienced, and vice versa. I would want to learn what I could from them.
Well, thanks a bunch for telling us that. And I mean, I appreciate that you took the time to talk about this, like, you know, many different topics. We went so many areas, like, you know, as a second generation Hispanic, that, you know, an American that you are, because I think that that's just the experience of a person that has been born here. You know, it's just like going so many places. Like, you had to navigate politics and religion and education and economics and language. And it's just like overwhelming to a certain degree. But I want to thank you for taking the time. So appreciate that time, Tony. As it is our custom in the podcast, we want to give the last word to our guests. So just tell us whatever you want to tell us about, second generation Hispanics, Americans, immigrants, whatever comes to mind. Give us the final word.
Thank you, Jose. I really appreciate this opportunity. And the final word would be that Hispanics in this country of the United States have enhanced and have helped to build part of this great nation that we are today. And I really, honestly, sincerely feel proud to have been, to be part of this country. I know my parents are. My parents love this country. They have lived here longer than their native original country. And it's just been a beautiful opportunity. That was also, when my parents arrived, was also 40-something years ago. So I also understand that it's not the same now for the recently arrived. And it's still going to be, in my optimism, it's still going to be a beautiful experience that this country is going to be further developed by those that keep entering.
You've been listening to Disruptive Adventism. We hope that today's topic helped you to think and change something about your practices, about your faith, about your Adventism. If you want to subscribe, make sure to go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be there. And make sure to give us a review if you like what you're listening to. If you want to support, make sure to go to patreon.com/disruptiveadventism. It helps us pay our bills and produce the content that you're listening to. And if you want to socialize, make sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram or on Twitter, and hit us up whenever you need anything. We'll be there to support you. Thank you for listening today. We hope you join us next time. And as always, we invite you to be disruptive.
Producing content, not easy. Creating a business plan to reach the masses, even harder. That's why Good To Go Media is hosting Collab Media and Film in Redlands, California, this September 8 and 9, where you, the content creator, can learn all about business plans, distribution, legal guidelines, and more. Presenters like Mark Butler and Randy Jameson will walk you through the tough parts of the content creation process. And if you need a financial boost for your project, the event is having a pitch competition where you can receive a prize of up to $20,000 to bring your ideas to life. Go to goodtogomedia.org to register and use code DISRUPTIVE for 20% off your ticket. Again, goodtogomedia.org, discount code DISRUPTIVE.